Most UFC fighters aren't afraid of losing. Losing is familiar. It's public, it's recorded, and eventually it fades. What they're afraid of is what doesn't fade. The damage that follows them home. The pain that lingers long after the crowd is gone. That fear has a name, and it's Justin Gaethje. Fighting him isn't about winning rounds or protecting a record. It's about what still works when the fight is over. Torn muscles, legs that won't respond the same way, bodies that need weeks just to feel functional again. Even fighters who beat him talk about the cost. Even victories come with consequences. And that's why this matchup feels different inside the UFC. Because stepping into the cage with Justin Gaethje isn't just agreeing to a fight. It's accepting a price you already know you're going to pay. Inside the UFC, fear doesn't start with highlights. It starts with conversations that never reach the cameras. Locker rooms, training camps. Quiet warnings pass between fighters who've already been there. When the name Justin Gaethje comes up, the tone changes. Fighters don't talk about his record. They talk about how they felt afterward, about how long it took before they could train normally again, about injuries that didn't show up on medical suspensions, but showed up every time they tried to move explosively. This is how reputation really forms in the UFC, not through marketing, but through shared experience. Fighters pay close attention to patterns. They notice when different opponents, with different styles and different strengths, all describe the same aftermath. Limping out of the arena, legs swollen for days, muscles that feel compromised in ways they've never experienced before. When those stories repeat, fear stops being emotional and becomes informational. It's no longer, "I'm scared of him." It becomes, "I know what happens if I fight him." That distinction matters. Emotional fear can be managed. Informed fear changes decisions. This is why Gaethje's reputation spreads faster than most. Fighters who lose to him talk about the punishment, but so do fighters who survive. So do fighters who win rounds. So do fighters who technically succeed, but physically pay for it. Inside the locker room, that's the worst kind of reputation, because it removes the illusion of control. You can out-strategy a dangerous puncher. You can avoid certain exchanges, but when every path leads through damage, preparation becomes psychological as much as tactical. Coaches understand this too. They don't say it publicly, but camps adjust when his name is mentioned. Sparring intensity changes. Recovery planning becomes more conservative. There's an unspoken acknowledgement that this fight won't just test skill. It will test how much damage a body can absorb before something starts to fail. And fighters feel that pressure long before fight week. It creeps in during camp, during conditioning sessions, during moments when the body is already sore and the realization hits that this is only the beginning. That's how fear becomes systemic. It's not built on mystery or hype. It's built on accumulation, on stories that line up too cleanly to ignore. Fighters know they're signing up for violence every time they step into the cage. But with Gaethje, they also know they're signing up for consequences that don't end when the fight does. And once that understanding spreads, it reshapes how his opponents think long before the first punch is thrown. The fear isn't about the moment. It's about everything that comes after. At some point, every UFC fight becomes a problem-solving exercise. Fighters look for patterns, weaknesses, safer paths. Against Justin Gaethje, that instinct breaks down quickly, because there is no version of this fight where safety exists. Backing up doesn't protect you. Standing your ground doesn't protect you. Even fighting smart doesn't guarantee anything. Every option carries a cost, and Gaethje's style is built to make sure that cost is paid no matter what choice you make. Most dangerous fighters rely on specific moments. A big counter, a single shot, a mistake you can avoid if you're disciplined enough. Gaethje doesn't wait for mistakes. He creates situations where damage happens by default. If you pressure him, you walk into leg kicks and hooks that don't care about position. If you retreat, he follows, chopping at the base, forcing your body to absorb impact while moving. If you try to slow things down, he accelerates the pace until structure starts to fail. There is no neutral exchange. Every second is spent taking something away. That's what separates fear from respect. Respect is knowing someone is dangerous. Fear is knowing you can't reduce that danger through planning. Fighters prepare entire camps around minimizing risk, distance management, angles, defensive responsibility. Against Gaethje, those concepts don't disappear, but they lose power, because his damage doesn't require perfection. It requires volume, intent, and time. And time is the one thing every fight guarantees him. This is why opponents often look uncomfortable, even when they're landing. Clean punches don't stop the pressure. Winning exchanges doesn't stop the accumulation. The body keeps absorbing impact, even when the mind thinks things are under control. And that disconnect is where panic begins. Fighters realize that the fight they planned for isn't the fight they're in. They're not reacting to strategy anymore. They're reacting to survival. What makes this worse is that Gaethje accepts risk as part of the transaction. He's willing to be hit if it means he can keep hitting. That removes one of the biggest deterrents fighters rely on. Most opponents hesitate because they're protecting themselves. Gaethje doesn't hesitate, and when one side removes hesitation, the entire dynamic shifts. Exchanges become unavoidable. Damage becomes mutual, but uneven in consequence. This is why there's no such thing as a clean win against him. You don't glide to a decision. You don't shut him down without absorbing punishment. Even when fighters control moments of the fight, the cost keeps rising. Legs stiffen. Breathing changes. Movement slows. Small advantages disappear. And once the body starts negotiating with pain, technique follows. By the middle of the fight, the question is no longer about tactics. It's about tolerance. How much damage can your body absorb before it stops responding the way you need it to? Against most fighters, that question comes late, if at all. Against Gaethje, it arrives early, and once it does, fear becomes unavoidable, because there's no escape route left, just decisions about how much more you're willing to take. This is the point where the story around Justin Gaethje changes shape, because if you keep treating him as an anomaly, nothing fully makes sense. His career doesn't follow the clean logic fans expect. He isn't undefeated. He isn't dominant in the traditional sense. He doesn't control fights the way technicians do. And yet, he keeps being placed at the center of the division's biggest moments. That contradiction isn't accidental. It's the clue. Justin Gaethje didn't rise because he solved the sport better than everyone else. He rose because he fits what the system quietly rewards. The UFC is built on entertainment first, longevity second. It doesn't punish fighters for taking damage if the product delivers. It amplifies violence that keeps people watching. And Gaethje delivers violence consistently, regardless of outcome. Win or lose, his fights produce chaos, damage, and narratives that travel far beyond the cage. That's why losing doesn't stall his momentum. Losses don't erase his value, they often increase it. Because the system doesn't measure success purely in control or efficiency. It measures it in impact. Crowd reaction, bonus checks, viral moments. Gaethje's style guarantees those things. Even when he's hurt, even when he's finished, the violence remains the point. And the system responds exactly the way it's designed to. This is where fear stops being personal and becomes structural. Fighters aren't just afraid of Gaethje the individual. They're afraid of what fighting him represents inside the UFC hierarchy. A fight where caution looks weak, where safety looks passive, where refusing to engage can damage your standing as much as losing. Once you're matched with him, you're already being pulled into the system's preferred outcome. Violence is expected, damage is inevitable, and restraint is quietly discouraged. That pressure changes behavior. Fighters who normally rely on patience feel pushed to trade. Fighters who value longevity feel forced to gamble. Not because Gaethje demands it verbally, but because the system around him does. He becomes the benchmark for what exciting looks like. And once that benchmark is set, others are measured against it. This is the inversion most people miss. Justin Gaethje isn't breaking the rules of the sport. He's following them too well. He shows what happens when damage becomes currency, when punishment becomes entertainment, when the body becomes a tool to be spent for relevance. The fear around him exists because fighters understand that stepping into the cage with him means stepping into a machine that doesn't care how carefully you fight. It only cares that something breaks. Once that realization lands, the narrative shifts completely. Gaethje stops being a wild man. He stops being reckless. He becomes a mirror, a reflection of what the system selects, elevates, and repeats. and that's far more unsettling than any single punch. Because systems don't stop with one example. They replicate what works. This is where the fear around Justin Gaethje becomes impossible to ignore. Because against him, winning doesn't close the story. It doesn't reset the body. It doesn't even slow the consequences down. Fighters walk out with their hand raised and still feel like something has been taken from them. Not confidence, not momentum, something physical. Something that doesn't come back on a normal timeline. That's the difference most fans miss. A typical win gives you relief. It gives you recovery. It gives you time to rebuild. Against Justin Gaethje, victory feels unfinished. The adrenaline fades, and what's left behind doesn't match the result on the scoreboard. Legs tighten instead of loosening. Muscles don't respond the way they should in the following weeks. Small movements feel unreliable. Fighters don't talk about this publicly, but inside camps, it's obvious. The body didn't escape clean. This changes how wins are processed. Normally, fighters leave a successful fight thinking about what's next. Who's the next opponent? Where the momentum leads. After Gaethje, the question shifts. Can I train normally again? How long before this leg feels stable? How many weeks can I afford to rest before opportunities disappear? Because in the UFC, time is never neutral. Rankings move. Divisions don't wait. A successful fight that delays your return quietly costs more than it appears. That's why his opponents often look different in their next appearance. Not dramatically worse, just subtly altered. Movements slightly more cautious. Exchanges chosen more carefully. A hesitation that wasn't there before. These aren't tactical flaws, they're physical negotiations. The body remembering something the mind would rather forget. Against most fighters, you recover and reset. Against Gaethje, you adapt, and adaptation has consequences. Training camps shorten, sparring intensity drops. Recovery becomes a priority instead of an afterthought. These adjustments don't show up on a stat sheet, but they compound over time. One altered camp leads to another. One delayed return leads to lost timing. The career doesn't collapse, it narrows. Fewer windows, less margin, less freedom to take risks later on. That's the quiet tax of fighting him. You don't just pay it on fight night, you keep paying it afterward. And the scariest part is that there's no clear moment where you can say it was worth it. Even fighters who gain recognition, bonuses, or momentum still carry damage that outlives the reward. The system moves on quickly. The body doesn't. This is why winning against Gaethje doesn't feel like resolution. It feels like survival with a receipt attached. Fighters don't celebrate the same way. They don't reset the same way, because deep down, they understand that something fundamental has shifted. The body has been tested in a way that doesn't fully reverse. And once that line is crossed, every future decision is shaped by it. That's where fear becomes practical. Fighters aren't asking if they can win. They're asking what version of themselves will still exist afterward. How much of their physical margin they're willing to spend for one result. Because with Justin Gaethje, even the best case scenario still costs you something. And once fighters understand that, the fear stops being about the fight itself. It becomes about everything that follows. The long-term cost of fighting Justin Gaethje isn't speculation. Fighters have talked about it openly, just not in dramatic ways, not in press conferences. In interviews, podcasts, and post-fight reflections, the same details keep appearing. Legs that took months to feel stable again. Muscles that never fully regained trust. Training camps that had to be adjusted because the body couldn't handle the same load anymore. These aren't career-ending injuries. They're worse. They're the kind that quietly change how a fighter prepares. Dustin Poirier admitted that the damage from their first fight wasn't just painful. It altered how his body responded afterward. A partially torn quad from repeated leg kicks isn't something that heals cleanly on a short timeline. Even when the muscle repairs, scar tissue forms, flexibility changes. Explosiveness becomes something you manage instead of assume. That's standard sports medicine, not opinion. And Poirier wasn't describing a loss. He was describing a fight he won later in his career, when experience should have protected him. Michael Chandler has spoken about how difficult it is to recover from prolonged high-damage fights, especially ones involving repeated leg trauma. Fighters rely on stability more than raw strength. Once that stability is compromised, everything else slows down. Footwork, balance, timing. The damage doesn't show up as a single injury report, but it shows up in preparation. Camps get shorter. Sparring volume decreases. Coaches become more cautious. Not because they're afraid of the next opponent, but because they're protecting what's left of the body. This is the consistent pattern with Justin Gaethje. His style targets areas that are difficult to fully restore: legs, hips, core stability. These aren't injuries you tape up and ignore. They affect how you move for the rest of your career. Fighters can still compete, they can still win, but they do so with adjustments that weren't necessary before. What makes this dangerous is that none of it feels catastrophic in the moment. Fighters leave the cage on their feet, medical suspensions expire, the system moves on, but the body keeps a record. Every camp becomes a negotiation. How much intensity can I handle this time? How much contact can I afford? These questions don't come from fear, they come from experience. This is why fighting Gaethje often marks a subtle turning point. Not a collapse, a shift. Fighters become more selective, more calculated, less willing to engage in extended exchanges later in their careers. That's not because they've lost courage. It's because they've learned what prolonged damage actually costs. And once the body stops responding the way it used to, there's no switch that turns it back on. You manage it, you adapt to it, or eventually, you step away. That's the reality fighters understand long before fans do. Fighting Justin Gaethje isn't just about surviving a night. It's about accepting that some parts of your body may never feel the same again. And that understanding doesn't come from fear. It comes from facts. So the real question isn't whether Justin Gaethje is dangerous. That part is settled. The real question is what happens next. Because fighters like Justin Gaethje don't exist in isolation. They appear when a system proves that this kind of damage is not only tolerated, but rewarded. When violence creates visibility, when punishment creates opportunity. And once that pattern works, it doesn't stop with one name. Every generation produces its own version. A fighter willing to trade long-term stability for relevance. A style built on pressure, attrition, and acceptance of damage. Not because it's the safest way to win, but because it's the fastest way to stay visible. The UFC doesn't need to announce that preference. Fighters feel it. They see who gets pushed forward. They see which fights get promoted. They understand what kind of risk keeps doors open. That's why the fear around Gaethje matters beyond his own career. It's not about him retiring or slowing down. It's about who learns from his path. Who sees that you don't need to be flawless, undefeated, or technically perfect to stay at the center of the sport. You just need to be willing to give the system what it wants. Damage, chaos, consequences that someone else has to carry. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. If this formula continues to work, then Gaethje isn't the warning sign. He's the template. The proof that a body can be spent for momentum, that recovery can be postponed, that long-term cost can be ignored as long as the product delivers in the moment. So when fighters talk about fear, they're not just talking about one opponent. They're talking about a future where this style becomes normal, where saying no to damage means fading quietly, where the next version of Justin Gaethje is already training somewhere, learning the same lesson. That violence pays, and that someone will always be willing to pay the price.